Very good morning, everybody. It is 7 o'clock. You are very welcome to join us on The Breakfast Show here on Sky News. A triple whammy of strike crisis taking place today, talks that is. We'll speak to a rail boss, plus the new boss of the TUC, plus the latest from our Westminster accounts revelations. We'll get reaction from the SNP's Ian Blackford and the Shadow Attorney General Emily Thornberry. And with claim and counterclaim from Ukraine, we'll speak to the Ukraine ambassador at 9:30. It's Thursday, the 12th of January.
Bid to break the deadlock. The Transport Secretary says a renewed offer will be put on the table at crunch talks to avoid more rail strikes, as two other unions meet with ministers today.
Russia replaces its war commander as Ukraine's president disputes the capture of the mining town of Soledar. Root and branch reform. The SNP's call for a rule change around MPs' earnings from second jobs revealed in a Sky News investigation. A call to stop the forced installation of prepayment meters after it's revealed more than 3 million people were left in the cold after running out of credit. Australia cancels its one-day cricket series against Afghanistan in response to the Taliban announcing more restrictions on women. Flood warning. Parts of Tewkesbury in Gloucestershire are almost completely cut off by floodwaters, with more bad weather expected in southwest England and Wales. Going ape. We'll speak to a conservationist at Chester Zoo, revealing the birth of the world's rarest chimpanzee. The Transport Secretary Mark Harper says a renewed offer will be on the table at talks aimed at averting more rail strikes. Officials from the Rail Delivery Group, the RDG, which represents train companies, will meet with the RMT and the TSSA, a lot of acronyms, later on today in another effort to break the deadlock. Unions representing civil servants who are planning to strike next month, as well as junior doctors, will also hold talks with the government. A lot of chatting. Is it going to be hot air or will we get somewhere? Let's find out. Aisha's standing by for us in Whitehall. Good morning, Aisha.
Morning, Kay. Well, as you say, there's a lot going on today, various disputes across industries, lots of talks taking place today. And if we start by talking about the railways, well, the RMT union and the TSSA will be meeting with the Rail Delivery Group today. There's going to be a renewed offer put on the table, according to the Transport Secretary. And there's speculation that may well include a 9% pay offer, though that purely is speculation at the moment. What we do know is that on Friday, a backdated pay offer of 4% was rejected. But a big thing in all of this for the railway unions will be the clause that is specific to the driver-only operation. That's something that they say that they won't budge on. So even if there is a pay offer on the cards here, an increased one, it will depend on that as well. So far, unions, when it comes to the railways, have blamed the government, though the Transport Secretary has said that he's helped facilitate this new deal and that it is more than reasonable. And then when we move on to the civil servants, well, the Public and Commercial Services Union, the PCS, has 100,000 of its members taking 24-hour walkout strike action on the 1st of February, and that's going to be spread across 124 government departments and bodies, from the DVLA to Border Force, including the DWP as well. So really affecting anything from driving examiners down to airport staff as well. And then on top of that, the BMA will be meeting with the Health Secretary to hold talks there as well.
OK. Lovely. Thanks for now. Thanks very much, Aisha. We'll keep an eye on, of course, throughout the day here on Sky News, exactly what is happening with those talks. And also, we've got union leaders throughout the day on both on this programme and later on Sky News. Where else would you go to find out exactly what's going on? Meantime, the Foreign Office says it's supporting the families of two British men missing in the conflict zone of eastern Ukraine after unconfirmed reports about whether a body has been found. Andrew Bagshaw and Christopher Parry have been missing since Friday. The Foreign Office has said this: "We are supporting the families of two British men who have gone missing in Ukraine. We are aware of recent reports and are in touch with the Ukrainian authorities." The men were last seen heading towards Soledar in eastern Ukraine. President Zelensky has denied Russia's claim that it's taken the town. Moscow claimed it had killed hundreds of Ukrainian troops while taking the salt mining town near the city of Bakhmut. But Ukraine's president says fighting is ongoing. It comes as Russia's defence minister appointed General Gerasimov as the new commander of Russia's military campaign in Ukraine. The previous commander, General Surovikin, nicknamed General Armageddon, who was appointed last October, will remain as a deputy. And later this hour, joined by the former chief of the General Staff, that's Lord Dannatt. And also joining us after 9 is Ukraine's ambassador to the UK, Vadim Pristaiko. Also making news for you today, new research from Citizens Advice found that more than 3 million people ran out of credit on their prepayment meter last year because they couldn't afford to top it up. The Consumer Watchdog also found more than 2 million people are being disconnected at least once a month.
We're seeing unprecedented numbers of people coming to us because they can't afford to top up their prepayment meter. That literally means that they won't be able to turn the lights on, they won't be able to heat their home. Over the past year, we've seen more people with that problem than we'd seen in the previous 10 years combined. So it's a real issue.
Now, Britain's third largest party, the SNP, has demanded root and branch reform to the rules governing MPs' outside earnings and donations. The party's Westminster leader, Stephen Flynn, has written to the Prime Minister, calling the current system broken and corrupt. It follows the Westminster Accounts project from Sky News and Tortoise Media, which revealed that politicians have earned more than £17 million in outside income in just 3 years, and that 38 of them have taken on second jobs, even though the identity of their ultimate paymaster is unclear. Mr Flynn raised the matter during PMQs yesterday. Let's take a look.
Let's reflect upon numbers, and in particular, those numbers which were shone a light on by Sam Coates of Sky. Does the Prime Minister not find it utterly perverse that senior members of the Conservative Party are feathering their nest in this way?
Former leader of the SNP at Westminster, Ian Blackford, is with us now. It's always great to see you. Thanks for joining us on the
Pleasure
programme.
to be with you, Kate.
Do we need a complete overhaul of the system?
Yes,
Why?
we do, because there has to be transparency and there has to be trust. You know, that clip that you just showed there, let me thank Sky and Tortoise for the work that you've both done. But where you've got MPs that are not being open about where their earnings are coming from, and of course, being a Member of Parliament is an important role. You've been put there by the electorate and they need to know that you're doing your job. So there has to be transparency, and I think it is right that we see legislation that cleans this up. Not that long ago, we had the expenses scandal at Westminster. It's important that MPs are above reproach. We've had the situation, of course, where Owen Paterson was forced out of Parliament. You've got the situation where you have had MPs, where you've had paid advocacy. These things can't happen. And we need to make it very clear that politicians need to make sure that they've got the trust from the public for the job that they're doing.
Do you have a time frame?
I think we need to do this as quickly as possible. I think
what does that mean?
Well, I think really that the Prime Minister's got to look to bring forward legislation within this session of Parliament. It's an important issue. You know, we've come through a situation where, obviously, we had the situation with Boris Johnson, everything that went on with Partygate. The standing of politicians has suffered over the course of the last few years. So we have to take our own responsibilities to make sure that we have our house in order, that we have to be above suspicion. That means that we have to make sure that the rules are tightened up. Nobody's saying that there are things that MPs can't do, but it has to be fair and it has to be proportionate. And the primary responsibility of any Member of Parliament is to represent their constituents.
I mean, you've had a second job in the past, as we know. Is it possible for MPs to have second jobs as well as be an MP?
I think what we need to do is actually have rules that the public can have trust in. When I came into Parliament, I had a couple of non-executive directorships, and I gave a commitment at the 2019 election that I would bring them to a close. But of course, these were things that didn't have any interference at all in the job that I did. I was a full-time Member of Parliament, but I've chosen that I would not do that. But we need to make sure that the public can have confidence in the way that MPs are going around their business, and their primary responsibility is to represent their constituents, and there are no conflicts of interest, because that's important.
Why is it the SNP, you think, that is taking the lead on this overhaul and not, say, Labour?
Well, I think this has to be an across-party issue, because all of us have a responsibility, and I would appeal to parliamentarians across the House. Let's make sure that we take appropriate action. We need to be sure that we can be judged by the things that we do. And my plea to colleagues, let's make sure that we clean up politics. You know, we've got the situation, you're talking about second jobs, but there's all sorts of issues around all-party parliamentary groups. That's been raised as well. The fact that there's dark money involved in many cases too. We can't have this. So we need to make sure that we look at all the mechanisms, look at the way that Parliament operates. Let's make sure that Parliament is above suspicion and that we can all take pride and how we go about the job
but
that we do.
it's not new, is it? I mean, it's just that we've brought all of this with Tortoise Media together in one place with an easy-to-use tool. I mean, why has something not been done before now?
Well, I think people have actually raised this. I mean, you've had situations over many years. I mean, you've had a number of prime ministers that have gone in the very recent past that all of a sudden are generating really quite substantial amounts of money. Boris Johnson's has raised £1 million from speaking engagements.
2.8 million for Theresa May.
Exactly. So I think we need to look at someone that's been a politician that all of a sudden are using the fact that they've been in high office basically as a calling card to get paid. And so we need to make sure this is policed properly, and we need to make sure that people can have trust and have faith in the job that politicians are asked to do. So this whole thing needs looked at. The whole thing needs to be reviewed. We need legislation to do that, and it should be done on an all-party basis. And I'm pleased that the SNP is the party that's brought this forward.
What do you
but everybody else needs to step up.
OK, what do you say to those that suggest that Stephen Flynn, new job, just showboating?
No, because I think at the end of the day, it's about that responsibility that we have to the public. Sky News, Tortoise have shone a light on this. Politicians have got a responsibility to act, to make sure that we've actually got the best-in-class politicians, people that we can have faith in. Nobody's saying that there aren't circumstances where MPs have come in, that they've had other interests. You know, you've got people that have operated in public services, those that have acted as doctors, for example. To give one case where they can carry on in doing that, they need to make sure that they keep their skills up. But we need to make sure that the job that the politicians are doing is primarily about that responsibility that they have to their constituents, and they're not feathering their own nest. That's what this is all about.
Stephen Flynn was sat there on Monday exactly where you are now. He's the new leader here at Westminster. I asked him about suggestions that it had been a coup to unseat you. How do you feel about it?
Kay, I'm actually really looking forward to the job that I've got now. I spent 5.5 years as the SNP Westminster leader. I think I had 4 prime ministers over that period. I've accepted a new role as the First Minister's business ambassador. I'm getting on with that job. I'm also commissioning a report in a green industrial future for Scotland, which I'm going to take 6 months to do. So I'm really looking forward to the roles that I'm going to be fulfilling, and of course continuing to work as a constituency MP. So it's a new departure for me, using my previous skills working in business, working in the city, to make sure I can shine a light on a future for Scotland.
Was it a coup though?
Look, at the end of the day, I took the decision to stand down. We have an annual election for the SNP leader. I'd been consulting with the First Minister about the ways I can strengthen the argument for Scottish independence. I'm really pleased about the job that I'm going to be doing. I'm getting on with that, making sure I'm serving my constituents, but I want to make sure that I'm delivering the message as how we can revitalise the Scottish economy, how we can deliver sustainable economic growth. And in fact, I've now got the freedom to do that, and I look forward to having those discussions with you and others over the course of the coming months.
Well, your ultimate leader is meeting our Prime Minister later on today. He's heading up to Scotland. Does that show that he's serious about the union?
You know, I think there are differences that, of course, that we have with Rishi Sunak, but there are times that we have to work together. There are important things that the First Minister and the Prime Minister have to discuss. But my message to Rishi is he has to respect democracy. He has to respect that there is a mandate for an independence referendum that the Scottish Government has. But where it's appropriate, let's make sure that the two governments are working together.
Will she bring it up with him today?
I think the First Minister will use opportunities as the time arises to make the case that there is an independence majority in the Scottish Parliament. Our government was elected with a mandate in delivering a referendum. Rishi Sunak should respect that.
Oh, well, should your party respect what the Supreme Court decided?
Yes, we do, because at the end of the day, what we want to make sure is that we have a constitutional way of moving this forward. We respect the right of the Supreme Court to make that judgment. But this is a political issue. And how often are UK governments going to stand in the face of the votes of the people of Scotland? Let's remember the Tories have lost every election in Scotland since 1955. This is about the will of the people. It's about the right of the Parliament. Nobody was saying that the Prime Minister in the UK before Brexit didn't have the right to have the Brexit referendum. The European Union accepted through the Article 50 process the right of the UK to leave. What is the mechanism for Scotland to leave the United Kingdom if it chooses to do so? Prime Minister has to respect democracy.
Just before I let you go, there's a story in a lot of the papers this morning about Boris Johnson's team shredding documents ahead of this investigation into what happened with Partygate. Thoughts on that?
I think his whole behaviour when he was in office, he demeaned the office that he had, and of course we've got the investigations that are still taking place at Parliament, and he should face the justice of that committee. But at the end of the day, I think this is a man that breached the trust that was put in him by the electorate of the United Kingdom. It was a shameful period for our democracy.
It's always great to see you. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, Mr Blackford. Thank you.
Thank you.
And QR code, we've been showing it to you, haven't we, all week. It's on screen now. Use our search tool and discover how much money your MP receives. It's all in the Westminster account from Sky News and Tortoise Media. I bet you're thinking, what's going on about these front pages? I'll tell you. The Metro suggesting that rail strikes could continue for an extended period, with RMT leader Mick Lynch refusing to entertain the idea of driver-only trains. Same old Johnson, that's the story for you. That's the Mirror front page, which carries claims that Downing Street staff destroyed evidence ahead of a Commons investigation into Partygate. The Times has news of a government plan to let people keep their benefits and go back to work to try to boost the economy. But for some, it may be too late. The Telegraph reports that up to 750,000 borrowers may be on the verge of defaulting on their mortgages, especially the young. And finally, the Mail leads with a new report which says that pregnant women and new mums are being abandoned by the NHS as services decline compared with 5 years ago. Now, the Australian cricket team have pulled out of a one-day series against Afghanistan in the United Arab Emirates, due to take place in March because of Taliban moves to further restrict women's rights. Let's find out more. Should we? Standing by for us is Nicole. She is in Sydney for us today. Hi, Nicole, tell us more about this story. Good morning, good afternoon where you are.
Well, it's a significant step by Cricket Australia, and as you said, the reason that they've done this is because of the ongoing and ever-strengthening restrictions placed upon women and girls under the Taliban in Afghanistan. Now, what we've seen happen over the last few months is a ban on women attending university in Afghanistan. They're also restricted in terms of employment, especially those women who worked for non-government organisations, NGOs. Girls have been banned from high school, and increasing restrictions. They're not really allowed into parks and gyms. So Cricket Australia has decided to make a stand. It was due to play 3 separate one-day internationals against Afghanistan in the UAE. We've had this statement from the organisation. I'll just read it out for you. Cricket Australia is committed to supporting, growing the game for women and men around the world, including Afghanistan, and will continue to engage with the Afghanistan Cricket Board in anticipation of improved conditions for women and girls in the country. Cricket Australia has also said that they made this decision in conjunction with the Australian government, so they haven't gone it alone here. And it's worth pointing out that while Australia hasn't seen the same sort of numbers and scale of Afghan refugees that you've had in the UK, there has been about 23,000 Afghan refugees arrive here in Australia. Another 16,000 are due to come over the next 4 years. So that's a significant number for a country like Australia. And in terms of sport, interesting to note that Australia actually brought in the entire women's football team from Afghanistan during that sort of traumatic period of the Taliban takeover.
OK, Nicole, for now, thanks very much indeed. Thank you. Also making news for you this morning, Islamic State has claimed responsibility for a suicide attack outside of the Afghan Foreign Ministry in Kabul, which police say killed at least 5 people. A nearby hospital has said more than 40 others were wounded in the blast. Protests against Peruvian President Dino Bollorés's government have continued to spread through the south of the country, reaching the tourist city of Cusco. Health officials say 16 civilians and 6 police officers were injured after protesters tried to take over the city's airport, where many tourists arrived to visit Machu Picchu. Royal Mail says it's experiencing severe disruption to its international export service following what the company described as a cyber incident. Customers have been asked to stop submitting export items while the issue is resolved. Lord of the Dance creator Michael Flatley has been diagnosed with what he says is an aggressive form of cancer and has to undergo surgery. The 64-year-old dancer and choreographer is best known in the Irish dancing production Riverdance, which was first performed as a 7-minute interval break in the Eurovision Song Contest in 1994. Still to come on the programme for you, joined by Mick Whelan. He's the leader of the train drivers' union ASLEF, who believes there's zero chance of a resolution to end the ongoing pay dispute. Joined by the former Chief of the General Staff, Lord Richard Dannett, who wants Britain to send more tanks to Ukraine. They were searching for additional classified material in various locations after a batch was reportedly found in an office used by the president from 2017 to 2019 when he was VP after the Obama administration. Our US correspondent Mark Stone has the latest.
Well, I think difficult questions, increasingly difficult questions for President Biden as he tries to explain these classified documents and why they were where they were. The first batch was found in November, before the midterm elections. Their discovery only came to light publicly earlier this week. 12 or so documents classified, found at an office that he once used here in Washington, D.C. from his time just after being vice president under Obama. We don't know the details of what was in those documents. President Biden has not given any details about why they were there yet, but his team found them. They handed them over to the National Archives at the time in November. That prompted them to have a little look to see whether any other documents had been put in the wrong place. And lo and behold, they discovered, yes, a second batch had been. Now, we don't know how many, we don't know how classified they were, we don't know where they were found. But it raises, at the very least, questions about the carelessness with which classified documents were handled by President Biden. Now, politically, people are trying to draw an equivalence between this incident, or the two incidents of his missing documents, and Donald Trump's predicament with documents that he took from the White House down to Mar-a-Lago, his resort in Florida. I think it's hard to draw a neat equivalence for a number of reasons. Quantity, in the case of Biden, very few, 12 or so. Trump, several hundred. Intent, Biden's team found the documents, handed them over immediately. The suggestion is they were put there accidentally. With Mr. Trump, they were taken intentionally from the White House down to Mar-a-Lago. Indeed, that is the subject now of an FBI criminal investigation. So there's an attempt to draw an equivalence. There are, on Capitol Hill, politicians calling for an investigation. I think that will happen. But a neat equivalence, well, there isn't one. Questions, though, for Mr. Biden? Absolutely.
Well, rail union leaders have warned MPs there's still a lot left to talk about if further strike action is to be avoided. Mick Whelan knows all about it. He's the General Secretary of the ASLEF Union. Hi, it's good to see you. Thanks for joining us. I was listening to you with interest yesterday when you were speaking to a committee of MPs and you told them we're further away than we started from a deal. How can that be?
Well, we negotiate in good faith. You might not like our responses and none of us want to be in the position that we're in. But I found myself last week where a deal was announced in the press on a Friday afternoon, late on a Friday afternoon, that contained many things that were our red lines we'd already said no to, many things we hadn't discussed, and basically would destroyed our ability to actually eradicate every agreement we've made in the last 140 years, locally and nationally, with no right to renegotiate. No trade union is going to give up the ability to speak on behalf of its members.
Are there plans for new talks?
What's going to happen next is, and the industry know this, they've been dealing with this in the privatised sector for two and a half decades, that any deal has to go to my board, my executive committee. I naturally won't be recommending. They will make the decision. And depending on what they decide, will dictate whether we go back into that format of talks again or what we do in future.
Train drivers earn a lot of money, 60 grand. The offer, we're told, from the Rail Delivery Group, describe it as a landmark outline proposal. It would give you 8% over 2 years, which would mean that pay would go up to about £65,000. Is that not enough?
It's not quite true. The trouble is, it's average salaries for train drivers.
So some of them earn more than that?
Some in inner-city companies, some earn more, and in many areas they earn significantly less. But the reality of the deal was that it was 14% RPI last year. We're currently running something similar this year. We haven't had a pay rise for 4 years. In effect, it was a 20% pay cut for giving up every term and condition we've got, which had been incredibly unfair. And the value of the deal would have been hundreds and hundreds of millions of pounds in productivity that, you know, the deal itself doesn't make any economic sense in any way, shape or form.
But you must appreciate that when we're seeing that 3 million people have run out on the prepay meters and don't have any heat, and then we're looking at train drivers who earn, some of them, over £65,000, that's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money. And neither you or I, because I've watched you quite often do the politics of envy, you know, what we've got, we've paid for. In flexibility and productivity down the years. People doing 11-hour terms with bare 20-minute breaks, 5.5 hours, 6 hours in the seat. Many people still driving traction that is 29, 40 years old with no toilet facilities. The modern railway isn't quite as people imagine it when you see a nice, shiny intercity train going from A to B.
How much involvement do you think the government has in the negotiations behind the scenes?
Well, that's part of the problem. We don't actually work for the government. We don't work for the DfT or the Treasury. I've got 15 strikes on and 15 talks. So we're employed by every from Abilio to First Group to Trentalia to Advanti to whoever else. But the people that we work for have done a contractual deal with the government limiting their ability to give us a pay rise. Now, we have free collective bargaining. Now, the value of whatever you want to sell or buy is precluded by what you're allowed to talk about. So part of this dispute arose from the fact that when we went to talk to our employers, they said, we can't talk to you. Then we went to the government, they said, no, you've got to talk to your employers. So we had months of being messed around, pushed from pillar to post, before we balloted for strike action.
Do you find that this Transport Secretary is more willing to discuss with you?
I've met with him once, I found him incredibly personable, although apparently in the Daily Mail they found me unpleasant.
Are you unpleasant?
I hope not.
I don't find you unpleasant.
And, you know, I'm willing to talk to anybody. We don't want to be on strike. We don't want to be losing money. We want a resolution, but it has to be a fair resolution.
So what is it that you want? What are the main sticking points for you guys?
Well, having had no pay offer for 4 years and all of a sudden getting one that's so untenable it's frightening, I want somebody to come to the table, unrelease the shackles, talk to us properly about the true value, about what they want delivered, how they want delivered it. And if everybody thinks that we can just, because of the current crisis, give up everything we've ever had for nothing, it doesn't work that way.
How worried are you, though, that your members, train drivers, will become almost like dinosaurs? It does look as though trains are becoming more and more, into the future, driverless trains.
Well, actually, most of the Victorian infrastructure can't sustain driverless trains. It's a distraction. Before the pandemic, we were actually looking at...
HS2 is looking for driverless technology, though, isn't it?
Sorry?
HS2 will be...
HS2, but it's purpose-built. Most trains run on Victorian infrastructure with wonderful stations with palisades and nice pylons in the way and more furniture that we can't see anything. Also, DOO wasn't designed for 13-car trains with 1,300 people, one person on there. But our biggest problem is society. We've got train drivers and rail staff afraid to go around parts of our network at certain times, day or night. Prior to the pandemic, sexual assaults in our railways have gone up 180%. We had county lines with drugs, people with knives and acid. The reality is the society we live in, when you talk to passengers what they want a cheaper, safer, but they want a visible presence on platforms, in booking offices, on trains. And you can't have the situation where the only person on the railway is a train driver.
Are we looking at more strikes?
I believe so.
When?
Don't know. As I said, we meet next week to discuss I'll call it a non-offer, and determine... There's a lot of anger out there. I'm being inundated, both on social media and in my inbox by train drivers. How dare you talk about these things that we have rejected. So my board is 8 train drivers. I imagine there'll be an equal amount of passion next week.
And so you will continue to strike. Unless you get the deal, and it doesn't look as though you're going to get what you're looking for at this stage. The government, though, is bringing in legislation which means that you'll be breaking the law if you strike.
Interesting. What price democracy? We might have another debate another day between the Lobby and Transparency Bill, the Protest Bill, the Trade Union Bill 2016, which we're currently challenging in the courts, and the latest Trade Union Bill, and this latest legislation. Any form of indenture where people can't withdraw their labour and can't have a voice, naturally we'll oppose. I imagine the whole trade union movement will do it. We are moving in a direction as a society that does frighten me.
Do you think a way through this would be to how, because there's more and more unions striking, their members are striking, a day of national strike, a general strike?
We have to be very, very careful. We're allowed to do coordinated action. And the real problem is so many people have to jump through so many different hoops and in such different places. How you coordinate the action when you have to give different notice periods and what you have to do to comply with the legislation. You've got to be very, very careful not to take secondary action when you could be sued. And also, most trade unions are out there looking to do the best for their members. At a point in time, I look at the health service, and my wife worked in the health service for 48 years, and nobody wants to be out on strike. And those people deserve a massive pay rise.
But there is a day of action, national action, planned for the 1st of February by the TUC. Do you think that that would be viewed as a general strike? I
think it'd be termed as a general strike, but from what I know from the discussion that took place, an awful lot of trade unions are still balloting, won't be in a place to give the appropriate notice, so it won't be a general strike per se. And your members won't take part in that on the 1st of February? Again, I won't know until Monday when I meet with my board and what we're going to do. Well, it's getting tight then. Is it 2 weeks' notice you have to give? We give 14 days' notice, but we can do anything 14 days from Monday. OK. It's good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed for joining. I don't find you unpleasant at all. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Now, there are dozens of flood warnings in place for England and Wales, with border counties and southwest England most affected. Downpours are expected to continue, with a Met Office yellow weather warning for rain in place across Wales and also southwest England. As you can see, heavy rain has already left parts of Gloucestershire. The town of Tewkesbury is submerged, as you can see. Our meteorologist, Joanna Robinson, is with us now. Hi, Joanna. It's good to see you. What's going on in Tewkesbury? It always seems to get hit when there's a bit of rain, doesn't it?
I know. We've had significant rain overnight over parts of Wales. We've seen 50 to 70 millimetres of rain falling over the Brecon Beacons overnight, just over a 12-hour period. So significant rain there over other parts of Wales and into the southwest of England. Heavy rain there too. And all that rain's got to go somewhere. We've got this saturated ground, and that rain is just falling and adding into the river systems, and that's why we're seeing flooding in certain areas. Already this morning I've seen the flood warnings rising. It was 37 flood warnings across parts of England when I first got it this morning, but it's already at about 42 now. So it's worth keeping an eye on the flood warnings through the course of the day, as we will see further heavy rain across southern parts of England. And in fact, through this month already, we've already seen some areas of Wales and parts of northwest England have already received nearly their average January rainfall already, and we're not even halfway through the month. And we've seen these spells of rain moving in because we've had this zonal position of the jet stream across the UK, and that's been feeding areas of low pressure in with spells of wind and rain. That will continue over the next few days, but there is a change over the weekend. We will see slight change to colder conditions, so the risks will change to more wintry hazards as we go into early next week. So there is a change on the way, but for now, further spells of wind and rain and, gales at times too.
OK, for now, thanks very much. Thank you. Very quick look at the weather. What's it doing where you are this morning? Unsettled for the next week at least, with strong winds and showers or more prolonged rain, and it's going to be colder. If you're in the south, you're going to need your big coat. If you're in the north, long sleeves.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Now, with parts of the world experiencing extreme weather conditions, let's have a look at the impact of climate change on the planet. We've got our dashboard for you. The right half of the screen shows how the UK's power is currently being produced. No coal at all, 50% renewables almost. That's very good, isn't it? On the top left, you can see how much warmer the Earth is now than in 1880. That's when modern record keeping began. And finally, bottom left, the total amount of CO2 emissions in millions of tonnes. Wet wipes remain the biggest culprit in sewer blockages, according to Yorkshire Water. They have caused 46% of its blockages last year, which had to be cleared. The company warns that wet wipes contain plastic and do not break down, causing a block to the flow of pipes, as you can see here. So what they're saying is, please don't throw them down the loo, put them in the bin instead. 50% of blockages caused by wet wipes. Let's move on to what's happening in Ukraine, should we? Russia's defence minister has appointed General Gerasimov as the new commander of Russia's military campaign in Ukraine, removing the previous commander who served just 3 months in the job. So what is going on? Let's find out from the former chief of the General Staff, and that's Lord Dunnett. Hello, my lord. Thanks for joining us. It's always great to see you. What on earth is going on? What's your interpretation?
Well, it's a very interesting move that Putin has put Gerasimov in charge now. Gerasimov is the chief of the General Staff, so he is the #1 soldier in Russia. And I think you can probably interpret this as being something of a sign of desperation. Sorokovin, who was put in place in October, had a fearsome reputation as being the person that reduced Aleppo and Syria to nothing. So it was really felt that he was the really hard man that could make a difference. Well, he clearly hasn't been able to make a difference. The other problem is you've got quite a lot of tension between mercenary groups and the proper Russian armed forces. The Wagner group has been trying to take Blackford for some time, terribly keen to achieve a success and to say to Putin, well, we can do it, even if your army can't do it. But actually, they're struggling, and they haven't done it very well. So this attack on Solidar, which is a way of trying to get to Bakhmut, is another throw of the dice. But it's really interesting that Putin now, in some desperation, has put Gerasimov in overall charge.
What's happening in Solidar?
Well, it would appear that pretty World War I tactics are being employed. A large number of...
What do you mean by that?
A large number of Russian soldiers, probably many of those recently conscripted into the army, and therefore pretty poorly trained, have been thrown forward in sort of human wave type attacks. And satellite imagery shows a vast number of dead bodies in the area where there's fighting going on. The Wagner group tried to claim a couple of days ago that they'd taken Solidar. Both the Russian and the Ukrainian Ministry of Defence have said, well, actually, we're not quite so sure about it. So this actually underlines the tensions between the commanders of the Wagner group, that individual is trying very hard to get a high profile with Putin himself, and the tensions in the leadership of the Russian army. Hence, Putin has put Gerasimov in overall charge. It's a bit of a last throw of the dice. It's a little bit like General Patrick Sanders, our Chief of the General Staff, suddenly being sent from London to wherever we've got a campaign going on because the government's getting desperate. So it's very interesting to watch this development.
What do we know about the Wagner group?
Well, we know it's a mercenary group that's been in existence for quite a number of years. It's been a kind of proxy for Russian foreign policy and Russian military around the world, pretty active in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. It's a pretty nasty organisation. It's led by someone with a very, very murky background who is, I'm sure you've shown the pictures in the past, of him going around prisons, promising freedom if you come and fight to convicts. So it's populated with a lot of pretty nasty people who've got not much to lose in life. I mean, if you've been sentenced for some foul crime and you're in jail for probably the rest of your life, the opportunity to at least try and save a bit of your life by going to fight is quite a high motivation. So it's frankly, it's a sort of typically Russian move. You would never see it happening in the West. And it's pretty disgraceful, actually.
Suggestions that they may be responsible for the disappearance of two British men, Christopher Parry, 28, Andrew Bagshaw, who is 48, and suggestions that a body has been found.
Well, I mean, I can't comment on that detail. I think as far as those two are concerned, one has to say, well, top marks for them for wanting to have the human motivation to go and help. But of course, I think anybody thinking of doing that must realise that the risks are pretty high. So if you are motivated, and I would advise people not to go and become mercenaries, but people want to go out to that part of the world as aid workers to try and help, well, the motivation is admirable, but they've got to make sure that they're jolly careful to look after themselves and that they don't put themselves in undue danger. There's always some danger, but they should be really quite careful of measuring the risks to their own personal safety.
Talk to me about Challenger tanks. We're suggesting that 12 will go. That's what Ben Wallace is suggesting. Is that enough?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, I wrote a piece in one of the newspapers yesterday saying that the principle of sending some is right. 12 sounds pretty tokenistic to me. Given that we're only planning in this country to upgrade to Challenger 3 status 136 of our tanks, and we have many more than that, it would seem that 12 is too tokenistic, and I would suggest sending 25 or 30 or even as many as 50. That would make a real difference.
How does it make a difference on the battlefield?
Well, where we are in the campaign is we're probably going to see the Russians mount some other form of offensive late winter, early spring. the Ukrainians, now supported even increasingly by the West, and particularly if we decide to gift them tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, should then be strong enough to mount a significant counter-offensive. And if they can do that well, there is a chance that they could strike decisive blows on the Russians, perhaps even to break the morale of the Russian soldiers. And of course, what's so important about that is that I can't see, most people can't see, a negotiated settlement to this war. The opening positions are just irreconcilable. So if there's going to be a conclusion to this war in 2023, it's going to have to come on the battlefield. So the point really is that the West, America, France, Britain, Germany, really needs to get stuck in and behind and provide offensive capability to the Ukrainians so that they can mount an effective counter-offensive, break the will of the Russian army and actually win this war. That's what it's about now. We don't want to be here in a year's time, Kay, talking about the same things.
Is it not, though, a serious upscale by NATO countries in the situation in Ukraine? Where does that leave us?
It's an upscale in terms of the capability, but it's not an upscale in principle. We have been providing all kinds of military hardware to the Ukrainians really since the start of this war, and indeed before. This is different. It's not as if we're saying there should be a no-fly zone and NATO aircraft will be flying over Ukraine. That would be tantamount to the West actually physically getting involved with our own manpower. This is merely an upping of the scale of equipment that we're giving them and giving them an offensive capability. I don't see the issue of principle there. And as I've just been saying, I think it's the right thing to do to give the Ukrainians a chance to win this war, because unless they win this war is going to drag on.
Finally, how secure is Putin, do you think, in his position?
I think he's increasingly insecure. I think he's insecure from a variety of threats. One is the ultra-nationalists and ultra-hardliners in the Kremlin who don't disagree with the war but disagree with the way that he's been running it. And then I think there are others who actually are increasingly beginning to realise that this whole special military operation, a war now by any other name, is doing no good for Russia's reputation, no good for Russia's economy. And therefore, there are other groups that could be putting pressure on him. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. I think the group of Russian leaders who are probably the most disaffected at the present moment are the Russian military leaders, headed by Gerasimov. If he could find a plan and the moral courage to see it through, I could see a palace coup, a Kremlin coup, being led by Gerasimov, because the army is absolutely fed up with the interference that Putin has been exercising personally. They're desperately upset, if you like, by the way that corruption in their procurement system has produced them weapons that are manifestly inferior to Western weapons. So I think we need to watch Gerasimov quite carefully. He could be the one for the Julius Caesar moment to stick in the knife.
And do you think that Putin is very aware of that, which is why we've seen the latest developments?
I'm quite sure he's aware of it. He's probably trying to hold Gerasimov in quite close, but also putting the stakes on Gerasimov that if you fail, well, then you're out. So I think what's going on in the Kremlin, and of course we don't know in detail, we're only picking up scraps of information and trying to analyse them, but I think it's a very interesting time of what's going on in the Kremlin at the present moment.
Keep your friends close and your enemies closer.
That's it, Kay.
OK, my lord, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
Actually, just to let you know that we will be speaking to the Ukrainian ambassador to the UK in the 9 o'clock hour here on The Breakfast Show this morning, so do stay tuned for more on that. Meantime, new research suggests people who are suffering with long-term effects from coronavirus should expect their symptoms to resolve within a year. A team of Israeli researchers have found that mild disease does not lead to serious or chronic long-term morbidity. Somebody who knows an awful lot about it, Dr. David Lloyd, London GP, of course. Hello to you, Dr. Lloyd. It's good to see you. This is good news, right?
I think it is. Yes, it's great. It's come out of Israel, which, as you know, was a really very important country that got their population vaccinated very quickly and have really done very well out of COVID. And this research seems to look at the Alpha and Delta variants of COVID and seems to say that if you've got prolonged COVID with lots of symptoms and breathing symptoms in particular, you're going to get better within a year, whereas we were very worried that this is going to linger on for a very long time. So, yes, very good news. And the other bit of good news in it is that there is yet more evidence that if you've been vaccinated, you're less likely to get the prolonged COVID as well.
Do people have long COVID and don't even know they've got it?
Oh, you ask all these very difficult questions. I think so. I think there are a lot of people with an awful lot of symptoms at the moment. We're really struggling under the sort of triple threat of all these viruses. Lots of nasty flu around at the moment, and it's very difficult to distinguish them because we don't do routine testing anymore. But I think we're seeing an awful lot of people with COVID who are just having minor illnesses at the moment. So yes, no, I think it's a very good point.
There are lots of different strains of COVID, as we know, Omicron being one of the really challenging ones, Delta, there's a new one, I think, in the United States at the moment. Does that impact on whether you get long COVID or not? Does it depend on what strain you've had?
Well, that seems to be the inference from this research. This is just looking at the Alpha and Delta. So we've got to wait for more data on the Omicron wave to see whether that makes a difference to this particular part of the COVID problem, yeah.
OK, and as far as people who are still getting COVID, is it still the threat that it was?
Oh, dear. I think you and I and people who are at low risk it's now part of life that you're going to get COVID. I think that the people who are very vulnerable are still at risk, and hopefully they've all been vaccinated so that there is less chance of breakthrough infections. But it's still around. I admitted 2 patients with COVID last week as a GP. So we're all sitting there watching it and just desperately hoping that it'll come under control. 873 people died from COVID last week, so it's not going away. That's up a little bit on the week before. So we're just learning to live with it, but living with a terrible toll.
Let me ask you one final question, if I may, about a survey done by Macmillan Cancer Support saying almost half of cancer patients have had to fight for treatment on the NHS. Cancer treatment is obviously time sensitive. Why isn't it being prioritised, do you think?
Well, again, I'm afraid it all comes down to finding it jolly difficult to see your GP. The really worrying statistic is that about 1/4 of cancers are now diagnosed in emergency departments. There's departments that are absolutely overflowing, and they're having to diagnose cancer because people can't get to see their GP. And unfortunately, when someone comes into the emergency department with cancer, it's usually at a late stage. So yes, we've got a lot of work to do with cancer. And I could only say to everybody, please, if you've got any of what we call the red flag symptoms of cancer, and you can go to Cancer UK, the website, or anywhere to look up those symptoms, please do contact your GP, because once we know about it, the system, the 2-week wait system that the NHS has in place is still working, and you should get a diagnosis within a month and hopefully start treatment within a month if you've got it as well. So the aim with cancer, as you all know, is to catch it in stages 1 and 2, where we can really go for cure.
OK. Doctor, it's always good to talk to you. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you very much.
Now, Prince Harry has criticised the way the media has reported on his new book, saying he's been taken out of context and claiming that a dangerous lie has been spread that he boasted about killing 25 Taliban while serving as a soldier in Afghanistan. Joining us now from Los Angeles is royal reporter Sean Mandel. Hi, Sean. Good to see you. What's your big takeaway from this book?
I think the big takeaway from the book is the no holds barred attitude of it, and also the sort of dissonance between what I think Prince Harry believes he is doing with this book and maybe what outside perceptions are of that. Certainly he feels that this book is actually going to increase his chances of reconciliation with his family and actually also, garner more support to his side, when I think that both of those items are up for debate.
He's doing late night talk shows. He's done all sorts of interviews. How's he being viewed in the US at the moment?
Prince Harry's support is still very strong in the United States, as is the support for his wife, Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex. He was on Stephen Colbert's show the other night and got a standing ovation, chants of Harry, Harry, from the audience when he did that. And that, by the way, was the first live TV audience that he had been in front of for a late night show. He had previously been on James Corden's show, but that was during a pre-taped segment out and about through the streets of Los Angeles. This was in studio with an audience, though taped ahead of Monday, actually. But people here are definitely still flocking to his side, but there is a little bit more, there's a larger faction of people who find the whole affair rather cringeworthy, to be honest. And that is seen not just on social media, to where there have always been people who are detractors of the couple in addition to those who are supporters, but also if you look in the mainstream US news media, which has typically and traditionally up until this point, up until the documentary and this book that he wrote, have all been very supporting of the Sussexes, or at the very least sort of neutral throughout. And now there is a little bit more questioning whether or not Prince Harry and Meghan Markle and the Duchess of Sussex, whether this sort of tour of airing their grievances, as some view it to be, has run out of steam and maybe run its course.
Our weary king is out and about today with the public. How is he viewed in the US?
I think more negatively, certainly, than his son, Prince Harry, and his wife. I think that, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on where you fall along these lines, King Charles is always going to have a more difficult relationship with American subjects, American citizens, because of the specter of Princess Diana that still hangs over how many Americans feel about Charles, about the king, and that only gets churned up even more every time there is a book, for example, like Spare. Every time there is a new season of The Crown, and there are new people, new generations of people who are discovering sort of the War of the Waleses that dominated the 90s prior to Diana's tragic passing in 1997. So I do think that unfortunately is something that, for the king anyway, that is something that is always going to impact his popularity here in the United States.
And a final thought before I let you go, do you think the hurricane that is Harry is now blowing through, or do you think we're going to get more?
Well, I'll just say that this is a book that is part of a multi-book deal that the Sussexes have with Penguin Random House. And, this whole, affair has been drawn out over several years now. So I don't think that the hurricane has fully subsided. Maybe a new one coming in shortly, or in the coming months. We still have the coronation ahead of us, and we haven't had a book from Meghan yet. So something I'm looking forward to.
It's good to talk to you. Thanks for staying up late. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
My pleasure.
So I finished the book. If you've not read it yet, have a look, see what you think. Apparently it was the fastest selling non-fiction book in the US, the UK and Canada. Now, there are a cluster of stars 200,000 light years away from Earth, which could provide insight into how the first stars were formed more than 10 billion years ago. New images captured by the world's most powerful telescope show gas and dust developing into stars near the Milky Way. No idea what I'm looking at. Astronomers believe studying the region could help them understand how the first stars were formed 2 or 3 billion years after the Big Bang. So there you go. It's very pretty, but I'm sure very many people who are cleverer than I will be able to tell me exactly what I'm looking at. You can tweet me directly if you would like to, at Kay Burley. Could it be crunch time for the Transport Secretary Mark Harper, who said a renewed offer will be on the table for rail unions? The General Secretary at the Trade Union Congress, that's Paul Novak, will be with us in the next hour. We've also heard already from ASLEF, the Train Drivers Union. They say that there will be more strikes on the railways. Just what you wanted to hear over your conflicts. I'll see you at the top of the hour. Do hope so.